Good morning and welcome to Sharper Iron. Spend the next hour with us studying the living and active Word of God, His two-edged sword of law and gospel, recorded for you in Holy Scripture, all about Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and descended for you. Thanks for tuning in this morning here on Worldwide KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. I'm your host, Pastor Timothy Appel of Grace Lutheran Church in Smithville, Texas. Sharper Iron is underwritten by the Lutheran Church Extension Fund, where your investments help support the work of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Visit lcef.org for more information. On this Thursday, September 24th, we're studying Proverbs chapter 16, verses 25 through 17, verse 6. Only when our way is shaped by the Lord and His wisdom will we walk in life. The way that seems right to us only leads to death. To help us sharpen our faith in Christ as we study God's Word today, we have with us regular guest, Pastor David Appold. Pastor Appold serves at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Paducah, Kentucky. Pastor Appold, welcome back to Sharper Iron.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me back on.
As we get started this morning, Pastor Appold, what do we need to know about the book of Proverbs as a whole, wisdom literature in the Old Testament that will help us into the Proverbs that we're looking at today?
Sure. It's always good to know the context of any passage that you're looking at, especially when you're doing kind of like we're doing, which is just going verse by verse, chapter by chapter. It's a little difficult and different in Proverbs because it's not like a story that's building, right? You don't necessarily have certain characters that have a backstory. That being said, there are certain themes in the book of Proverbs, and I think what we'll find today as we go through the Proverbs that we have, Tim, is I'm sure you've talked about this before, but the way of wisdom and the way of folly. And those two ways kind of charting out, here's what the path of wisdom looks like, here's what the path of folly looks like, that gets extrapolated or analyzed in so many different ways in the book of Proverbs that the point is to help you see what path am I on and what path should I be on? What path do I want to be on?
Yeah, that's definitely a theme, the idea of two ways, the way of wisdom, the way of folly. Solomon's put it the way of righteousness or the way of wickedness as well. And those themes continue to come forward. You're right that there's no real narrative. Although I have talked about characters, I'm putting air quotes up right now, characters
Sure.
in the book of Proverbs. In the first couple chapters, there was Lady Wisdom, there was Dame Folly. You meet a sluggard more than once, you meet the worthless man, you meet the fool. So there are, quote, characters that you see their actions play out, but it's not as one continuous narrative. You get more like snapshots, maybe, into a person's life here and there. What does the way of wisdom look like at this moment? What does the way of folly look like in comparison to it? And that's generally how the book of Proverbs works. So go ahead.
One other thing before we get into it, the book of Proverbs, and this is true of the Bible, more generally speaking, but it speaks in kind of universal categories. And I think that makes us, as modern readers, that makes us uncomfortable because we always, with any rule, there's always an exception, right? And so we get so interested in the exceptions and qualifying everything that we say that then you come to Proverbs and it's like, look, this is the way of wisdom. It's like this. And it speaks very general, very universal. And that's what I love about the book because it touches on, it goes against kind of our modern way of thinking everyone is an exceptional case, but it reminds us there really is such a thing as human nature. And there is such a thing as also sinful nature that will manifest itself in these particular ways.
Right. Let's go ahead and see then how that plays out in today's text. We'll take it about half for this side of the show and then half on the other side, and we'll just go through them one by one or bounce around a little bit as it comes. Proverbs 16, beginning at verse 25. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. A worker's appetite works for him. His mouth urges him on. A worthless man plots evil, and his speech is like a scorching fire. A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends. A man of violence entices his neighbor and leads him in a way that is not good. Whoever winks his eyes plans dishonest things. He who purses his lips brings evil to pass. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. That was through verse 31 of chapter 16. I'll pause there. So we'll just start with that very first verse, Pastor Appold. verse 25, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Now, we've seen this previously in the book of Proverbs. Back in chapter 14, verse 12, we got the same thing. There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. So Solomon repeats himself here. How do we understand this verse? How is it that the way that I think is right is going to lead me to death?
Well, it's kind of like, why does he have to repeat it? Because apparently people are forgetful. And this is what I was saying before about when you start to really think about human nature, it's easy to kind of, we want to be positive, right, Tim? We want to be optimists. So if we think about everyone as being sort of inherently good and knowing what's right, and things in the world are very clear and obvious to us, then that's I think a sign of our folly, right? To think that I know what's best for myself, but that's so common for us. This is why in our church is using setting 1 of the divine service right now, and it starts off, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. So this idea of self-deception, that this is what it looks like to be a fallen human being, is that we deceive ourselves. And so we don't know on our own how things, what's the best path for me to follow. And you can hear people say things like this all the time, even people who are not Christians, who are not necessarily informed by biblical wisdom. They recognize this, right? My actions, the choices that I make, had all kinds of unintended consequences, right? So I made this choice when I was 25, and it wasn't until I was 35 that I realized, oh my gosh, that was a terrible choice. That was a terrible thing to do.
So a couple of things at play here. One, you mentioned self-deception, that we think we know what is right. Solomon calls us to recognize maybe you don't. One thing that stands out about this verse in particular is that the two lines are not in parallel, in the sense that one is the negative half of it and one's the positive. The first half of the verse speaks, this is what you think is right, but here's the contrast. This is the way that it actually leads. There's not the positive side of it in this verse, although I think it's there in the book of Proverbs as a whole. So, I mean, this verse doesn't say that there's absolutely no way that a person can figure out the right way to go. It's that the way that I think on my own, that won't lead me the right way, but implied, at least in this verse alone, and then explicated in the rest of the book, is that there actually is a way to go that is right. It just doesn't come from inside me.
Yeah, you need a guide, right? If you're hiking in the woods and you've never been there before, and the trail is not paved for you, you don't have all the road signs or the trail markers there. It's really helpful to have somebody who's been through the woods and who can tell you, oh yeah, I know the way to the cabin or to whatever the destination is. That's what I think in Hebrews this comes out. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. I've heard people talk about this as like Jesus is the trailblazer, right? He knows the way. He's gone on the way, and now he comes to us and gives us the Holy Spirit to bring us on that way, the way of faith.
Right. So there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. We don't want to take this too far and say, well, it doesn't matter what I do. It's just going to end in death anyway. We don't want to fall off on the side of despair. What is the path that this verse does point us on then?
You mean like, what is this? What would be maybe if I could give you a biblical example of how this proverb would come out. Think of, there's any number that we could go to, but think of the original fall. The devil comes to Eve and he says to her, right, did God really say all these things? Look at this fruit. It looks good, right? It's describing, I think, how temptation works. So temptation always, the devil is going to present things to you as attractive, as appealing things. So I think in Genesis 3, it says Eve looked at the fruit and she saw that it was, I forget the order here, but she saw that it was beautiful and that it was to be desired to make her wise. So it looked good. There was a way that seemed right to Eve, but its end was death. I mean, quite literally, that was the judgment that God had promised with that particular piece of fruit. So that's a good example historically or biblically of one of these, how the proverb plays out. And I think we could generalize then into just about every temptation. There is some appealing aspect to sin. Sin appeals to our desires or to our passions, to the things that we love. And it hides, or we deliberately hide it from ourselves. I mean, there is a part of our fallen nature is that we are blinded to how things go, and we deceive ourselves. We ignore what should be obvious to us and say, yeah, actually, if I do this, I know it's contrary to God's word, but it's gonna come out well for me.
I'm reminded of in chapter 9 of the book, where you have Lady Wisdom calling out, and then Lady Folly calls out right after her, that there's a lot of similarity in the way that they speak. There's a lot of similarity in the way that they look, but those are all surface things, and they hide the reality. Well, I should say what Lady Folly does hides the reality of what's behind her. She calls out, she speaks sweetly, but Solomon is very clear. If you go there, that's going to death. And so he's exposing the reality. And I appreciate you bringing out Genesis chapter 3, the fall into sin, because I do think it is a good example that it seemed right to Adam and Eve to do this, but it ended up leading to death. And the reason was because it wasn't actually right. Even though it seemed right to them, it wasn't. It's always struck me when she looks at the fruit and she thinks that it's beautiful and desired to make one wise, because she shouldn't have thought that, at least not based on what God had said. It should not have, based on what God had said. I don't think that the fruit should have been desired to make her wise. The fruit should have been avoided so that she wouldn't fall into death.
Yeah.
I guess my point is, how do you know whether or not the way is going to lead to right or death or life? It goes back to what has God said about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so as you're talking there, Tim, it makes me think what is informing your eyesight. So when you look at the world, you can look. Two different people can look at the same situation, and one can say that is something that I don't want anything to do, and the other person can look at it and say, wow, doesn't that look great? Isn't that the purpose of life? Isn't that the goal? And so if I could put it this way, it's what goes into your ears is going to color your eye, or it's going to shape how you view the world. And that's why I don't know, maybe this is one way to connect these proverbs. The next couple of proverbs talk a lot about deception and how words and whispers and murmurings, how these things stir up all kinds of trouble in the world. And one way to see that and think about it is how do the devil's lies, how do they change the way that people and even Christians will perceive the world around them. The world is not just a blank canvas that I take in with my eyes, but I have, even before I look at things, before I inspect the world around me, I have preconceived notions about things.
So take us into those next several proverbs that speak toward this deception. There seems to be quite a bit of wisdom concerning the way we talk, which is definitely a theme we've seen from Solomon elsewhere.
Yeah, so if you look at verse 27, I think there is sometimes you get this in Proverbs where each verse seems to kind of stand on its own, but every once in a while you get a building through the verses, so one builds on another, and I think you can see this pretty well in 27, 28, 29, and 30. Let me just read those again. A worthless man plots evil, and his speech is like a scorching fire. So you've got the one who's plotting evil, and then parallel to that is we're going to think about his speaking. A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends. A man of violence entices his neighbor and leads him in a way that is not good. Whoever winks his eyes plans dishonest things. He who purses his lips brings evil to pass. So if you just kind of think through, and it's helpful if you can see the text in front of you, but you've got the first half of each of those verses describes a certain kind of person, a dishonest man, a worthless man, a man of violence, right? And then in the second half, usually you get some aspect of his of his words. His speech is like fire. He is a whisperer. And then this man of violence, he leads people in a way that's not good. How? Well, not by force, but through deception, through the deception of his words.
So the character of the person, that's seeing 27, 28, and 29, you're right, on the paper is very helpful. The character of the person, whether when he's worthless, he's dishonest, he's one of violence, is going to have an influence on what is coming out of his mouth and how he's using those words. Right.
So the heart. How does Jesus say it? He talks about the good tree bearing good fruit, or the wicked tree, the bad tree, the poison tree bears poisonous fruits, right? And out of the fullness of the heart, this is the verse I was trying to think of, out of the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. So as long as I'm plotting things in my own mind, I mean, that is not good if I'm plotting evil. But as long as it's just in my own mind, Tim, it's only affecting me. But it's through our words, through the things that we say to each other, the plotting comes out from me and spreads into the world.
So we see a progression of the sin from within the person, then as to how it comes out of the person, right, and how it begins to affect others. And that starts with the person's words.
Right. And this is, I know I've been on here before with in the book of James, and our listener James is so great because, and it's a good parallel with Proverbs, because a lot of the book of James has a similar kind of proverbial. It's a proverbial sort of genre in the epistle of James, and so you can think of some of the famous passages in James that talk about our speech and talk about the tongue as this, this thing that sets the world ablaze and on fire. Well, why does that happen? It happens because our words actually have a huge impact and influence on the people around us, right? Words, language. If you control the language of any situation, you can usually control the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, there's that old, well, it's an English proverb, I suppose. It's not from the book of Proverbs, that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We probably talked about that when we talked about James 3. And it's just not true. I mean, and you see it over and over again here in the book of Proverbs, that words actually do have a very profound influence on yourself and on the people around you to bring, and here Solomon is really bringing out the negative effect of the words James picks up this same theme, the scorching fire. That's the way James speaks as well.
Yeah. And I think that's very helpful for us in thinking about how, both aspects. What are the words that I'm hearing, that I'm taking in? How are they impacting my own thinking, my own actions? And also, what are the words that are coming out of my mouth, or in the modern world, what are the words that I'm typing? I mean, you just think about how much media exposure we almost all have. I told my congregation recently, what would happen if we all took you remember reading about monks taking vows of silence? Yeah. I always thought, who would ever do that? But now I understand. Now I know. Could you imagine a world where things were just silent for a week? There'd be something a little bit nice about that, wouldn't there? Maybe I'm revealing something of myself here, but I think that there's a lot of people who would agree with me. It would be nice just to have silence. Silence.
Yeah. The amount of words that you can consume is amazing. I mean, you can fill your ears or your eyes, if you're going to look at it on a screen, with words constantly, 24/7. And I think, that's part of what Solomon is getting at here with these verses, is there is an amount of self-reflection to see, am I the worthless man? Am I the dishonest man, or the man of violence who's speaking in this way? But there's also the self-reflection, am I listening to this person? Yeah. And taking that in, and then being led along such that I'm separated from my close friends, or my life is consumed in fire, or I'm being led in a way that is not good. Both things I think are at play in these Proverbs. What am I listening to, and what am I speaking?
I think you're right on. And this gets into kind of more generally, the gift of wisdom literature, not just Proverbs, but also say Ecclesiastes or the book of Job, is to understand you. It allows you to understand the world that you live in, so that you're not blindsided by things, right? So you can think of this in terms of just understanding my own mind. I think it's St. Paul who says, who can understand himself, right? So we are a bit of a mystery to ourselves. And there he's talking, that's in Romans 7, I think, where he's talking about the struggle within every Christian between the desires of the flesh and the desires of the spirit, right? So there is a bit of a mystery there. But as you grow in your faith and in your understanding, you start to understand how your own mind works. And Proverbs does that not just for me as an individual, thinking through how am I living, how am I thinking, but it also helps you think about human nature, the nature of the created world around us, and what it means to live in God's world.
Now, how does verse 30 fit into this progression, or does it? Because particularly the second half of the verse speaks about actually pursing your lips, so staying quiet, but that too can bring evil to pass. How does verse 30 fit into this progression? How do those things go together? Yeah,
so 30 says, and I don't know, maybe you have some insight onto the pursing of the lips, but if we take it as parallel to the first half of the verse, I think that can help us. Whoever winks his eyes plans dishonest things. He who purses his lips brings evil to pass. So I have little kids, Tim, and I like to joke around with them. And one of the things kids love is you tell them something, but you wink. And so they know they're on the inside. Daddy is not serious about this. So, just to use a silly example, I'll say, now none of you can have dessert tonight, and I'll wink at my oldest son. And so he knows Daddy said one thing, but he means the opposite. Okay. Well, the person who is always winking is just a blatant deceiver, is a blatant liar. They're saying one thing publicly, but they mean the opposite, or they mean something else, maybe not necessarily the opposite, but you've got sort of the public speech and then the private intention. And I think the pursing of the lips must be, I don't know enough about what that means there, but I would take it as parallel and just say it's a further way of saying the same thing. This is the sign of someone who is tricking you.
Yeah, I would definitely connect the two, and maybe the connection is the idea of scheming together. That when you're because I think you're right on with the image of winking your eye and saying one thing but meaning another, such that the pursing of the lips is another sort of winking of the eye in the face of evil. So I see my neighbor who's plotting evil. Maybe he's the worthless man, the dishonest man, the man of violence, and I just kind of wink my eye at what he's doing, and then at the same token, I purse my lips at what he's doing. I don't speak up to stop him. I guess that's how I would put the two together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. So you in that instance, you perceive the evil thing, but you're not going to warn anybody about it. You're not going to say anything. So in that way, you become what would we say, an enabler of the thing.
Right. And I think in that way, then these proverbs do go together in terms of speech, that there is a time to be silent. But here's Ecclesiastes, right? I don't know is this in Ecclesiastes 3, a time to be silent and a time to speak up? It may not be, but it's along same line.
It's in Simon and Garfunkel, so It must be in Ecclesiastes too.
I think it's the Byrds who actually sang that. But anyways, that's okay.
Oh, is it?
I don't know. That's really not our generation, I don't think.
The listeners will tell us. You'll get emails.
They will. But just think of I'm thinking more along the lines of the Eighth Commandment, really, and the explanation that Luther gives, that there is a time when I need to be quiet and not slander my neighbor's reputation, but there is a time when I need to speak up in his defense, that the way I use my lips is sometimes to shut them, and it is at other times to open them to speak up for what is good and right.
Yeah, and so how do you determine that? Well, it's like in the book of Proverbs, aren't there two kind of contradictory? The fool answers. It's foolish to answer the fool in his folly, but then the very next one says, but you should do it anyways. So there is a time, and this is what the Spirit gives us, is the wisdom to know when is the right time to speak and when's the right time to be silent.
Right. And I mean, that goes back to the very first verse of this section, the way that seems right to a man. We let the Lord shape our way. When is the right time to speak? When is the right time to be silent? Let the Lord in his word shape that way and direct us in that path of wisdom. Pastor Appel, just real quick here before the break, let's pick up verse 31, because it is a slightly different topic, but I think it will connect to something on the other half of the show when we pick up later.
Sure.
So what's this business?
You want me to read it?
Yeah. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life.
Yes. So my hair I'm 33, Tim, and I just recently have found gray hair on my head, so I have attained these things. I think the point here, and this gets into a biblical view of things, is that old age, living out your days, is a mark of wisdom. So you didn't die in in your youth. You didn't die in your middle age because of foolish choices you made. But again, generally speaking, and there will be exceptions, but generally speaking, if you've lived to the age of gray hair, you must have done something right. And what Proverbs is bringing out is not just, hey, somehow you got lucky and you lived out your life, but you've lived a righteous life. That there are, and again, generally speaking, there are rewards for following God's law. The life of the righteous, generally speaking, will be blessed by God. Now, there's also, I don't need to give the exceptions.
Well, no, I mean, and that's something we've seen throughout the book of Proverbs so far, and we'll continue to see that, generally speaking, there are rewards to living according to the wisdom that God gives, old age being one of them. You're listening to Sharper Iron here on KFUO. Going to take a short break, but we'll be right back. Please stick around.
Did you know that Lutherans are helping new American immigrants get settled? How about struggling church workers in need of support and refreshment? And we assist at-risk children and provide disaster response to hurricane victims. Through LCMS recognized service organizations, we are doing all this and more. I'm Rahema Kavuga of Lutheran Church Extension Fund, and I don't want you to miss out on hearing what your brothers and sisters in Christ are up to. Visit interesttime.org to see how your support gives life to these works of mercy and love.
What do you think of when you hear the word college? Expensive? Liberal? Woke? Imagine a college that is affordable, a college that is unapologetically conservative and Lutheran, a college that won't take a dime of federal funding, a college that teaches the best of our Western heritage, a college where students grow in the Christian faith instead of leaving it behind. This is Luther Classical College, a college by Lutherans and for Lutherans. Visit our website, lutherclassical.org, subscribe, become a patron, and join the thousands who are making Luther Classical College a reality.
Welcome back to Sharper Iron. It is Thursday, September 24th. We're studying Proverbs 16, verse 25 through 17, verse 6. We've got Pastor David Appold with us. He serves at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Paducah, Kentucky. If we miss the proverb that you wanted to hear more about, remember that you can call in to the listener comment line, 314-996-1542, or send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org. Leave us a message there. Let us know what proverb you want to find out more about, whether it's from this text, a previous text, or an upcoming text, and we'll be recording some short podcast bonus material, just short segments that dig into one proverb in particular, if we happen to miss something that you really wanted to hear here on air. Pastor Appel, on the first half of the show, we looked at verses 25 through 31 there in chapter 16. I'm going to read the rest of our text for today, and we'll keep talking. This is Proverbs 16, beginning at verse 32 now. Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. A servant who deals wisely will rule over a son who acts shamefully, and will share the inheritance as one of the brothers. The crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, and the Lord tests hearts. An evildoer listens to wicked lips, and a liar gives ear to a mischievous tongue. Whoever mocks the poor insults his maker. He who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. Grandchildren are the crown of the aged, and the glory of children is their fathers. That is the rest of our text for today, going all the way through Proverbs 17, verse 6. Pastor Appel, these Proverbs, at least as I'm reading them here again, don't seem to hang together quite as well as we were able to find in the first half of the program, but maybe we'll find some connections as we go through them.
We'll see.
Just starting there in verse 32 is a very powerful image that's there in verse 32, talking about, I think if I had to talk about it in terms of maybe the New Testament, this would be the fruit of the Spirit that we would call self-control or self-discipline.
Yeah, right. And like you said, the image is what's so, I think, helpful with this proverb. And this, again, we can kind of broaden our scope here. This is, in some ways, this is how the Proverbs work, right? It's almost like they're meant to be memorized, and they're meant to be, especially these ones that give you the image, they're meant to be sort of dwelt on and kind of mulled over in the mind. So this one here, you've got two men who are presented to you, the one who controls himself, right? The one who's slow to anger. And then you've got the one who is like a warrior who can take over a city. So which of those two men is the better man? The one who can control himself, or the one who can control a bunch of people in a city? And what the proverb points out is it's much harder actually to control your anger than it is to conquer a city. And so the better man speaking here is the one who's slow to anger. It's a different kind of might. It's a different kind of power. And I don't know, is it the kind of power that people are going to pursue? Probably not. But by the Spirit, this is the better way.
And I think that fits very well with everything we were talking about on the first half of the program. When it comes to matters of speech, when you talk about what comes out of your mouth, self-control is huge there. Even thinking about what we were saying about old age, how often is self-control related to living a longer life, that I prevent myself from doing some of those things that might not lend themselves to long life, putting myself in situations that would lead to a quicker end of my life than not. Self-control as might here really overarches a lot of the other things that we were talking about. How am I going to stay on this path of wisdom, this way that would not lead me to death, instead lead me to life? Self-control is a huge part of that.
Yeah, and you can see the way. So the first half of the Proverbs, it gives the particular thing. So controlling your anger, whoever is slow to anger. The second half, just thinking how the Hebrew parallel works here, broadens that out from the particular, controlling your anger, to the universal thing, ruling your spirit. So not just anger, but the other passions that might, rise up and overtake us. If you are actually in control of yourself, you're able to recognize these things and do what is appropriate with them. Sometimes it may be right to be angry, but other times, most of the time, your anger is probably motivated by something else.
Right. I do think it's important to recognize self-control as one of the fruit of the Spirit listed there in Galatians 5, because it is a reminder that the book of Proverbs is founded upon the fear of the Lord, that the wisdom that's given here in Proverbs, while there's going to be, and we've talked about this on other episodes, that there is overlap here with what you might call worldly wisdom, that someone like Mark Twain or someone like Benjamin Franklin or older, Aesop's fables, there's going to be overlap between those things and the book of Proverbs. But what makes this book uniquely Christian is that starting place that Solomon gives us. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of instruction, or the beginning of wisdom. And that's true of self-control here too, as one of the fruit of the Spirit.
It's interesting you say that. In the book of Acts, there's this kind of odd passage. I think especially as Lutheran pastors, it seems odd to us because it gives a summary statement. I wish I had it. I didn't write it down. But it says something about like Paul spoke with them about, I can't remember, sin and the resurrection and self-control. And as Lutherans, as Lutheran pastors, you read it and you're like, okay, sin. Yeah, we talk about that. Resurrection. Absolutely. Wait, why was that part of his, common speech? But you think about living in the world that we live in, self-control is it's hard to come by. It's hard to find. It takes a lifetime to develop these things. And it takes not just human control, but it takes, like you mentioned, divine help.
So speaking of the book of Acts, since you brought it up, verse 33, that was maybe not the smoothest connection, but verse 33, the lot is cast into the lap. There are lots that are cast in the book of Acts to make decisions.
Yeah. And
in verse 33, you've got this connection about lots being cast and decisions being from the Lord. What's going on in verse 33?
Yeah. Okay. So we should know what casting lots is, because I don't do that. Do you, Tim?
I don't think so.
Yeah. So the casting of a lot is whether it was, I'm just trying to think of the common examples, rolling dice or picking, who gets the short stick.
Right.
The idea is somehow you're leaving the decision about, whatever the choice is, whether it's, I've got two options. Which one should I pick? Well, I'll roll the dice. And if I get a even number, I'll go with one, or I'll flip a coin. That's even better. Who rolls dice?
I have a son who likes to play Yahtzee.
So the idea there is that when you do that, the decision is outside of your control, right? So the lot is cast into the lap, and who's directing the decision? Well, it's just fate, right? Or it's nobody is. It's blind luck. It's blind chance. Well, what the Proverbs says is that it's from the Lord, and so what would you think if you met someone who every decision that they made by casting lots? I would look at that and I would say, listen, man, the Lord gave you a brain, use it, right? But that's a little. I don't think Proverbs is trying here to say we should always and only use lots. But what it is trying to say is those who seek the Lord and his counsel and his will for things, that's a much better way of making decisions than just, I'm going to look at this according to my personal understanding and what I think is right.
The scriptural examples that come to mind for the casting of lots, I mentioned the book of Acts. This is how the replacement for Judas is selected. They narrow it down to two: Matthias, who ends up being chosen, and is it Justus? I think that's his name. And they cast lots at that point to let the Lord decide. The other example that comes to my mind is the book of Jonah, where Jonah is identified as the problem on that ship,
right,
based on the casting of lots. So, there's the examples from Scripture, at least. I think the point that you made is right on, that and maybe we can connect this to verse 25 again, that the idea that if I'm going to follow my own way as if I'm in control somehow, well then I'm being a fool. And actually that casting a lot, trusting in the Lord, would be less foolish than simply thinking that I'm in charge. To go back, you brought up the book of James. It's in James chapter 4 where James talks about, you shouldn't go around saying, I'm going to do this tomorrow or I'm going to do that tomorrow, but you should say, if the Lord wills, I will do these things. And maybe that's how you connect here with verse 33 and verse 25 within Proverbs.
Yeah, isn't it in Proverbs 2? Lean not on your own understanding,
right?
But cast your cares, or I can't remember the second half of the verse, but that is a common theme that we've seen here. And what we would direct people to is to say, you don't, the way that you can discern the Lord's will is not simply by casting a lot, but you can look at what he actually says.
Right.
And so you want to keep God's commandments as sort of that's the place that we look to see what should I be doing in this area of my life. And sometimes you'll get a very clear answer, like I should stop doing that. But other times it's roomy.
Right. There's an element of Christian freedom in some decisions.
Yeah.
What career should I pursue? Well, there are certainly vocations that would be out of bounds. There are things that would go against the commandments that God gives as a way of earning a living in this life. And so we would say no to those. But within what God does say yes to, there is freedom. in that decision? And is there going to be an exact answer for you in this life? Well, maybe not. And that's where this matter of trusting in the Lord comes into play, because maybe when you make a decision like, well, what career am I going to pursue? There is an element where it almost feels like casting lots. I mean,
Sure.
Certainly you take into account the wisdom of your parents, the wisdom of close friends, of trusted Christians, of your pastor, as you approach decisions like that. But in the end, it is the will of the Lord that is directing things, and He's directing things for your good, so that in those moments where it may seem like you're casting a lot, you're still trusting in the Lord, leaning not on your own understanding. I looked that verse up from Proverbs 3 while we were waiting. Yeah. Pastor Appel, let's just keep going here. 17 verse 1. And again, I don't know if there's a way to connect these. Better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. Now we've gotten a picture of family life here in this verse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're looking at what makes for a blissful home? What makes for domestic bliss? What are the options that are presented here? You can either have a lot of stuff and have strife, have anger and conflict, or you can have basically nothing, just a dry morsel. But again, this goes back to my thing about the value of silence. The quietness that's described there is not necessarily volume, but there's no strife. There's not hostility between a husband and a wife or parents and children, but everyone knows their place and is content in their place and loves the family. Which of those homes would you prefer? That's what the proverb puts before you. And of course, I mean, we would say, oh, it's obvious. I want the peace and quiet. It's easy to say it, but it's much harder when you're actually presented with all the, if you can have all the stuff, right? Well, who's going to say no to all the stuff? Because if you put a big piece of, if you put a pie in front of me, Tim, there's going to be some part of me that says, I want to eat the whole thing. Right. And this is what I think you find more common in our day and age. People don't set out to have strife in their homes. I've never had pre-marriage counseling with people and they said, oh, Pastor, we want to have we want strife in our house. And so we're going to try to do as much as we possibly can. It's much more incremental. So you keep adding on straw after straw after straw, and eventually the camel's back breaks, right? And that's what I see much more common than just the immediate. All of a sudden we have all this stuff, and so we're so busy that we're in conflict all the time. It happens slowly.
Right. And perhaps it happens slowly because of what the goal is. Where are the eyes focused? Are the eyes focused on gaining a house full of feasting, a table that is full of food? And again, to expand the image, but a house that is full of stuff, earthly wealth. Is that where the eyes are focused? If it is, then it is much easier for that strife to creep in. Whereas if your eyes are focused on the house that is full of peace, the keeping of the fourth, the fifth, the sixth commandments, matters of authority and life and marriage, when the focus is there, well, perhaps that won't lead to a house full of stuff. But that, and to go back to what you said about, this is to take up verse 31 again, that there is a reward to that sort of lifestyle. It may not be the reward of lots of stuff, but the reward of peace within the family and in the household is a great, great joy. Yeah.
It's almost like what is the purpose of marriage and a family? Is the purpose to if we can have two incomes instead of one, then we can get a lot more stuff, right? It almost becomes this marriage and family life becomes the means to some other end, the attainment of, I don't know what, a vacation home or a boat or whatever, what have you. That gets things precisely backwards. The marriage, a husband and a wife and parents and children, that is the end, the home at peace together. That's what, that's the goal, not the means to some other goal.
So this this imagery of household, or the setting of household, does stick around in a couple more Proverbs.
Yeah.
Verse 2 talks about a servant who deals wisely will rule over a son who acts shamefully and will share the inheritance as one of their brothers. The language is of a household, but the imagery that's there is maybe a bit disconnected from our day and age. What's there in verse 2 for us, Pastor Appel?
Well, so you've got to think a little bit, not as a modern, but as an ancient person, just to get the image right. So there's two kinds of people who live in the house. There's the family, the sons, and then there's also the servants, those who work there, who aren't tied into it. And what the proverb is sort of getting at is, which would you rather be, right? Would you rather be part of the family by blood, or would you rather be, just connected to the house through whether you're a slave or a servant or whatever? And it's interesting because usually the answer would be, well, I'd much rather be a son than a servant, because a son is an heir and is going to inherit the thing. But what the proverb does is show, look, just because of your status as a son, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to be faithful. And would you rather be the dishonest son or the faithful servant? Sometimes it's better. How would I generalize this? Sometimes it's better to not have the status, but to be recognized as someone who is, I guess I'll use the word worthy, someone who is worthy of trust and who can be trusted with a thing.
So, and I think you're right on that it's better to be a faithful servant than a foolish son, or a wise servant than a foolish son. Maybe we stick with wise and foolish. How do we take that into account in today's world where, I don't have any servants, Pastor Appel, and I'm guessing you don't either. I've got kids. How do we take that sort of thinking and apply it today?
I think you could see this, maybe not so much in the household, but in your job. There is, again, we're in the realm of speaking generally, so there's going to be exceptions, but generally speaking, if you're a hard worker and if you're trustworthy, you will be recognized for that, right? And it's also true that sometimes people who are just, inherit the next in line, who are over you, aren't necessarily, they could be totally worthless, right? They could be foolish people, but you will still be recognized for your work. Again, we're just speaking in general statements here, and so there is encouragement to keep doing a good job, even if you're not getting all the accolades, if you're not getting all the promotions. There is a reward for your work.
Yeah, maybe, and if I can, and how you apply this to a household today, I'm not entirely sure, but the place where I want is like, what gives you the place in the household? Is it the bloodline, or is it the wisdom? And one who would rule over his household well should be looking for wisdom from the people connected to his household, whether that is a son or a servant or maybe a friend of your son. How you're looking for wisdom from those people. That's what is most important when it comes to the connection to the household. I want to connect it to the church, at least in part, that it's not the church. Those who are part of the church, it's not about bloodline, physical descent, but it is about, faith, right? We would say it that way probably rather than wisdom, although those things are certainly connected. That for the servant who's maybe sees himself on the outside looking in, it is the path of wisdom that is the way in. It's not about the bloodline. I probably mixed some metaphors there and tried to say too much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because the wise servant, it says in the proverb, you actually will share the inheritance. You become like one of the brothers, right? And the shameful son is going to be in disgrace. He might have received the inheritance, but he's looked out or he's looked down on. And so in the church, I don't know exactly how to apply it. It is difficult sometimes with these proverbs to say what exactly is the meaning. Does it just mean, work hard, keep your nose to the grindstone, and you'll get recognized, or is there some? Because I see what you're trying to do. You're trying to say, in the New Testament, you get a lot of talk about, so we are no longer slaves, but we are sons. And if we are sons, then we are heirs. And so you're trying to connect the language of inheritance and sharing an inheritance with, the New Testament teaching on justification by faith. And there may be something there.
Right. Yeah, that is the connection I'm trying to make. We've got just under 5 minutes here, Pastor Appold, and if you want to go to a different one, that's fine. But just looking at the verses that we haven't talked about, verse 6 sticks with the household and does come to a theme that we brought up on the first half of the program, the idea of old age. Here, not the image isn't gray hair, but the image is grandchildren. Grandchildren are the crown of the aged, and the glory of children is their father. So once again, we've got the idea that long life is a blessing given to those who walk in the way of wisdom, and it's particularly connected then to children and grandchildren.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So Jesus says something very similar to this. Jesus says, I think it's in Luke, that wisdom shall be justified by her children. And I think that is what this proverb is saying too, or the first half anyways, that, how does it go? Grandchildren are the crown of the aged. So you can see this, we talk about people having their children or their grandchildren or their pride and joy, but they're also sort of a demonstration of what have you taught your kids? What have you taught your grandchildren? So let me just give a personal example. When we would go on vacation, we're from Michigan, and we would always go to the same spot up north in the Upper Peninsula. And we would go on Sunday morning, we would always go to this little Lutheran church. I think it was called Faith Lutheran Church. And when we went, this was with my dad's side of the family. So we would double the size of the congregation when we would go, because there was like 35 or something of us, and we're all Lutherans. And it was just great because we would look at, my grandpa and my grandma, and we would say, from those two people came these 35. And by God's grace, they had all been preserved in the faith, not just in the family, but in the Lutheran faith. And it was so cool to see that. And I know my grandpa, that was something that he would talk about, that the best part of vacation was going to church together and being surrounded by his grandchildren, worshiping the Lord, receiving Holy Communion. That was always such a neat thing. And that's what the proverb is saying. Your children and your grandchildren they are your crown because they display what you've taught them.
Pastor Appel, with just a real quick minute, we've talked about a variety of topics today. Tie this together in terms of Christ. How does Proverbs, this section in general, point us to Christ?
Well, Jesus talks about being greater than Solomon. And so the teaching of Christ is the teaching of true wisdom, and the life of Christ is the display of, the perfect path of wisdom. There is no folly in his steps. There's no folly in his teaching. And so I think for those who follow Christ, there is this wonderful promise that you are walking in the way of wisdom. And when we talk about following Christ, what we mean by that is living by faith. By faith, we are given this gift of wisdom, and by faith, we walk in the way of wisdom. And that has its rewards in this life, but it also has the promise of eternal glory when there really will be no doubt about it. There will be no question about what kind of reward comes for the wise in Christ.
Pastor David Appold is the pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Paducah, Kentucky, helping us this morning with Proverbs chapter 16, verse 25 through chapter 17, verse 6. Pastor Appold, thanks for being our guest today.
Yes, thank you.
I'm your host here on Sharper Iron, Pastor Timothy Appel of Grace Lutheran Church in Smithville, Texas. Thanks for spending the morning with us. Talk to you again tomorrow.